Hello, my name's Kieran Oberman. I'm from the philosophy department at the London School of Economics, and I'm here with Bradley Hillier-Smith to discuss his book, The Ethics of State Responses to Refugees. So I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about what inspired you to write this book.
Okay, sure. So I started first getting interested in this question about obligations towards refugees during 2015, when there was a large number of refugees arriving in Europe. And I was deeply troubled by what seemed to be like the extensive suffering and violations that refugees were subjected to. And I started getting involved a little bit in refugee charities, and that took me eventually to the Calais refugee camp in particular, and I was a regular volunteer in that refugee camp. And so for those who might not know, there was an informal refugee camp in Calais, populated by many thousands of refugees who were trying to seek safety in the UK. And there was one particular moment that had a profound effect on me, which was, well, in February 2016, the French authorities decided to clear the southern portion of the camp. And so I was there at the time and I witnessed this, and I witnessed hundreds of riot police move into the camps, physically rip refugees away from their shelters, destroy their shelters, their tents, their possessions. I witnessed one refugee attempt to commit suicide. I was trying to avoid being detained and taken away. The riot police used extreme violence, beating with batons, using rubber bullets and tear gas against the residents there, including against women and children. And as a result of this eviction of the southern portion of the camp, families were separated, about 100 unaccompanied refugee children went missing. A few refugees sewed their mouths shut and went on hunger strike in protest against the maltreatment by the French authorities. But their demands weren't met, and they were just ignored. And so witnessing this had a profound effect on me, because I witnessed what I took to be quite excessive violence and human rights abuses against particularly vulnerable people who were simply trying to find safety. And this was occurring in 21st century Western Europe. And so this had affected me because it struck me as obviously an unethical, or at least to me, unethical response, a way of treating refugees. And so I thought, well, what then would an ethical response be? What are states obligated to do in response to the presence of refugees seeking safety? And I thought, well, this is an important question that I want to find the answer to. And so that inspired my research to try and understand what exactly an ethical response to refugees would be, in the hope of potentially bringing it about.
Wow, so I can see that the book was inspired by this particular political context. That's something that the book very much speaks to. But presumably there's also a philosophical context. People have been writing in this area for a while. So what was that philosophical context
So
in writing?
I consulted the philosophical literature on obligations towards refugees, and I found that the dominant approach to understanding obligations towards refugees is what I call in the book a duty of rescue approach. Now, this holds that states in the global north, northern states such as UK, European states, the US and so forth, these states are mere innocent bystanders overlooking the harms that refugees are subjected to. And these states have duties to rescue refugees from these harms, at least if they're able to do so at little cost. Now, I thought that this is an important starting point for understanding obligations towards refugees, but as I argue in the book, I think it faces at least two limitations, which I think stem from the fact that it fails to pay close attention to certain morally significant features of the situation of refugees. So the first limitation, I think, is that the approach fails to pay close enough attention to a variety of state policies and practices that are used in response to refugees, such as border violence, such as that I just described in Calais, such as forced detention of refugees, forced encampment of refugees, forced containment of refugees in certain regions where they face human rights abuses. And these practices may make us question whether the states that adopt them are indeed mere innocent bystanders, as according to that dominant approach. And so I thought we need to pay really close attention to this overlooked feature of the current situation of refugees in order to understand states' negative obligations towards refugees, that is, obligations to not harm or violate the rights of others. And I think the philosophical approach, as I found it, had not sufficiently engaged with these practices or failed to provide an outline of the negative duties of states, which I think are prior and more urgent to any further duties. And the second limitation I found with that dominant approach, the duty of rescue approach, was that I thought it failed to pay sufficient attention to another morally significant feature of the situation of refugees, namely that refugees are suffering as a result of extensive and severe human rights violations, both in the causes of their displacement, as in why they're forced to flee, but also whilst they are displaced. And I think that this factor is morally significant insofar as it entails that refugees are subjected to certain distinctive and severe harms and injustices. I think this is morally relevant for understanding the strength and specification of states' positive duties towards refugees, that is, duties to actively protect and assist refugees. So I thought the dominant approach hadn't fully appreciated the moral significance of this fact, and I think acknowledging the significance of this fact reveals important implications for how we ought to understand the positive obligations to refugees. So the thought was that in focusing on both these significant features of the situation of refugees, we would have an understanding of the negative duties of states towards refugees and the positive duties of states towards refugees. And the duties that I outline in the book, the negative and positive duties, are duties that hadn't fully been acknowledged in the existing literature on obligations towards refugees.
Okay, so that's super interesting. It seems that your work relies on this distinction between negative duties and positive duties. So could you explain what the difference is there?
In the book, part of the methodology is to appeal to core moral commitments that are part of common morality. So what people would agree would be morally right and wrong. And within that, I think there is a distinction between negative duties and positive duties. So negative duties are duties not to harm or violate the rights of others. So they require refraining from acting and not harming others. And positive duties are duties to actively provide a benefit to others, right? And I take it that in common morality, we accept that we have these negative duties and we have these positive duties, but we accept that the negative duties are particularly strong. It might represent perhaps the most fundamental moral commitment in common morality, that we ought fundamentally not to harm or violate the rights of other people. And so the thought is we need an account of the state's negative duties to refugees, because to me it seemed like it had been under-acknowledged that states are in fact adopting these policies and practices that are in fact harming refugees and violating their rights. And if I could demonstrate that that would be true, then it would be true that these practices would be agreed to be quite substantially morally objectionable from the standpoint of common morality, and hence could motivate responses to seek their reform. And so, yes, that distinction is crucial. But that's not to say that positive duties are weak or anything like that.
So could you give me an example of a common garden negative duty and a common garden positive duty?
Quite simply, like a standard negative duty is like you have a strong moral duty not to torture a person, right? So all that requires from you is to refrain from performing an action that would cause harm to that person. So you have a strong negative duty not to torture a person. Now you may also have a positive duty to save someone from being tortured by someone else by simply hiding them or being able to protect them in some easy way. So you might have a positive duty to protect them. But the thought is that your negative duty not to torture someone yourself is particularly strong and stronger than your positive duty to protect others from comparable harms.
So for instance, it might be, I'm right in saying it might be, thought might be that it'd be wrong to torture one person, even if that would save a certain number, let's say 2-3 people, from being tortured. Is that the kind of thought that's going on?
Right, yes. So there's obviously philosophical debate about that. So some philosophers simply deny the distinction and think your positive duties to help to save others from harm are just as strong as your duties not to harm them yourself. But most non-consequentialists will say that your negative duties are stronger. And you can demonstrate that with a simple one-by-one case. So it might be impermissible to kill one person to harvest their organs in order to save another person from organ failure, or even 5 further persons from organ failure. So if that's true, then it would demonstrate that your negative duty not to harm someone yourself is that much stronger than your positive duty to save others from harm.
Great. Okay, so then going back to the existing literature, you were seeing this over focus, as you feel, on positive duties. Could you tell me a bit more about that kind of approach? So how were people envisaging the moral relationship between states and refugees?
Good. So, as I said, the dominant approach was what I call the duty of rescue approach, which held that states in the global north are just mere innocent bystanders overlooking the harms that refugees are subjected to, and they have duties to rescue refugees from the situation. Now, this approach sometimes invokes Peter Singer's famous drowning child case, whereby we're asked to suppose that you're walking through the park one day and you see a small child just drowning in the pond. Now, you could easily save this child at little cost to yourself just by pulling her to safety, but this would ruin your shoes, let's suppose. Now, the thought is, since that child is in desperate need of aid and you could save them at little cost to yourself, just at the cost of your shoes, you have a moral obligation to rescue that child, a positive moral duty to rescue that child. So then the duty of rescue approach applies that principle to refugees. So it holds that refugees are in this situation, in desperate need, facing significant harms, and states are able to help these refugees either through aid, resettlement, granting asylum, at little cost to themselves, and therefore they have a moral obligation to do so. So my concern with that approach was, well, that presumes then that the states in the global north play this role of the innocent bystander who's completely disconnected from the harm that the victim is enduring and has simply only a positive duty to alleviate that harm. And I don't think that that accurately captures the normative and causal relations between northern state practices and the harms endured by refugees.
Okay, good. So northern states aren't like a person on the side of the pond who could reach in and save this child. So what exactly is the relationship between states and refugees if it's not that?
Good. So these states adopt a variety of policies and practices in response to refugees. These practices include things like border violence. So, for example, in the Calais example that I started with, there'll be funding of riot police that engage in human rights abuses, harassment, intimidation, and violence against refugees. The same will be true at the Hungarian border with Serbia and across many European borders, for example, and the US-Mexico border. There'll be instances of border violence against refugees, resulting in significant physical harm and in some cases death. There'll be also practices of detention. So, for example, the 2017 Memorandum of Understanding between Libya and Italy and other EU states entails that any refugees seeking to make the crossing across the Mediterranean Sea to try and find safety in Europe are intercepted and returned and placed in detention centres on the Libyan coast, where they face appalling conditions, malnutrition, starvation, disease, as well as further human rights abuses, being tortured, subjected to sexual violence, and even traded as slaves. There'll be other practices such as forced encampment, the forced enclosure of refugees into camps. So, for example, as part of the EU-Turkey deal, refugees who had made the crossing from Turkey across the Aegean Sea to the Greek islands were forcibly enclosed into camps on those islands, prevented from engaging in onward travel to mainland Greece and mainland Europe. And so these camps denied free movement and the conditions were appalling. And there was also pervasive human rights violations in these camps, including sexual violence. And other policies and practices include containment. So containment is the practice and policy whereby states in the global north aim to contain refugees in certain regions in the global south away from their own territories by blocking off the main migratory routes to seek safety in northern territories. So, for example, the Memorandum of Understanding with Libya blocks that migratory route from northern Africa to Europe and thereby contains refugees in regions in northern Africa where they face extensive human rights abuses. And the EU-Turkey deal similarly contains refugees in certain areas by blocking off that main migratory route from Turkey across to Europe and thereby contains refugees in appalling conditions where they face human rights abuses in Turkey as well as Jordan and Lebanon. So these are the kind of practices that states are adopting, and they may make us question whether they are in fact playing this role of the mere innocent bystander, but they are instead actively involved in policies and practices that result in further significant harms, human rights violations and suffering for refugees.
Okay, good. So to go back to the image of the ponds, maybe it's not like the person is standing on the banks and they can reach in, but they're maybe preventing the child from leaving the pond. Is that the kind of thought?
Yeah, that is exactly the thought. So I analyze containment in particular in that way. So containment is that practice of preventing refugees from arriving by containing them in certain regions where they face threats to their human rights. Now, I suggest that this is a denial of escape case insofar as it denies a victim's escape from a harmful sequence such that the harm will in fact obtain to the victim. And so this, I suggest, is morally equivalent to holding the innocent child at arm's length in the pond, thus ensuring that they will suffer the harms, rather than letting them escape onto your dry land. So in this sense, I believe states are harming refugees by forcibly containing them in certain regions where they face threats to their lives, liberty, and human rights, and preventing them from escaping these severe harms.
Okay, good. So states do these various practices that you draw attention to really powerfully in the book, as well as here, saying the various harms that refugees suffer. Of course, states try and give justifications for those harms. So what kind of justifications do they often give?
Good. So we might think that, well, first of all, given that these practices, as analysed in the book, are instances of doing harm, right? And it's accepted that doing harm requires quite a substantial justification. So we need to find a really substantial justification in order to justify these harms. So one natural justification might be, well, look, states have a right to control their borders. And you'll often see this invoked by policymakers when they're enacting certain policies. We have a right to control our borders. And so this might justify adopting certain measures that will prevent or deter refugee arrivals. And so what I tried to do in the book is analyse whether the moral justifications for a right to control borders can extend to then justify these harmful practices used against refugees. And what I suggest is that I don't believe these justifications can extend to justify these harms to refugees. So I first look at justifications for a right to control borders based on a state's political, economic and cultural interests. And I think these particular interests are of insufficient moral significance to outweigh and thus justify setting back the most urgent interests of refugees to avoid abuses such as sexual violence, torture, and the extensive suffering they face. So I think those interests alone are not going to be sufficient to justify these substantial harms to refugees. But I then focus on one justification of a right to control borders, namely a state and its citizens' right to freedom of association. So the thought is that the state and its citizens have a right to freedom of association to exclude anyone they don't want to join their association. And this is supposed to be quite a robust right. And it's analogous to that of an individual to not be forced to associate with someone they don't want to, right? And so I analysed this potential justification to see if it can justify the harms to refugees through these current practices. And at first it seems that a right to freedom of association does include a permission to harm others in order to preserve one's freedom of association. For example, if someone was to continually harass you, wouldn't leave you alone, constantly trying to intimately associate with you, you would be permitted to cause them some harm in order to preserve your freedom of association, right? And also, we can imagine a case where this might apply to the state level. So if, to take one of Christopher Wellman's examples, if the United States was to forcibly annex Canada against Canada's wishes, but did so peacefully without further violence and so forth, we might think that Canada would be permitted to use some force in order to repel that imposition and to preserve its freedom of association and self-determination. So it seems then that maybe we could extend this to the current case of refugees. States are permitted to preserve their freedom of association and are permitted to harm others in order to preserve that freedom of association. So it looks like we might have the justification. But what I suggest is that, well, you don't have an unlimited or unconditional permission to harm in order to preserve freedom of association. Instead, there are what I argue to be plausible constraints on the permissibility of harming to preserve freedom of association. And those constraints are the following. So in order for harm to be permissible, so the first is the necessity constraint. in order for harm to be permissible to preserve freedom of association, it must be the case that that harm is necessary as a means of preserving one's freedom of association. But I don't believe that these current practices used against refugees are necessary to preserve freedom of association, because there are numerous alternatives, non-harmful alternatives. For example, sustained investment in regional programs that provide the infrastructure and human rights protection for refugees in regions closer to their states of origin, demonstrably disincentivize onward journeys to northern territories. So there's non-harmful alternatives. These current harmful practices are not necessary, so they violate this necessity constraint. The second constraint is the proportionality constraint. In order for harm to be permissible to preserve one's freedom of association, it must be the case that the harm you inflict is proportionate relative to the prospective imposition. And I think current practices violate this constraint quite substantially, because the imposition of the inclusion of a number of refugees would be insubstantial. It wouldn't affect people's day-to-day intimate associations, and it wouldn't affect the political community's self-determination in any significant way. Whereas if you compare that to the significant harms that attain as a result of current practices, which include extensive mental and physical suffering and severe human rights violations, it seems this harm is grossly disproportionate relative to the prospective imposition. And then the third constraint is the moral responsibility constraint. So in order for harm to be permissible to preserve freedom of association, it must be proportionate relative to the moral responsibility of the agents who you're harming. And so the thought is, those who are morally responsible for posing an unjust threat to you are liable to some harm, and so it's permissible to harm them in self-defense. Whereas those who are not morally responsible for posing a threat to you are innocent, and therefore are not liable to harm. And to assess whether someone's morally responsible for posing an unjust threat to you or not, we assess whether they had reasonable alternatives to avoid posing that imposition or threat, and whether those alternatives were the costs of accessing those alternatives. So for example, with the harasser that's trying to harass you, they're morally responsible for an unjust threat because they had many costless opportunities to avoid posing that threat to you, but they chose to anyway. So therefore it's permissible to harm them. But with refugees, they face significant constraints on what they are able to do. They face a life of either a life in squalid refugee camps, facing extensive human rights violations or destitution in urban areas. And so for many refugees, they have no reasonable alternative but to seek adequate safety in northern states. And as such, they're not morally responsible for posing an unjust threat, and therefore they're not liable to be harmed, and therefore it's impermissible to harm them. So through looking at these constraints, we see that current practices cause unnecessary, disproportionate harm against innocent people, and for that reason they can't be justified by a right to freedom of association. And so I suggest that these defences of a state's right to control borders cannot justify these harmful practices against refugees.
Okay, so that's super interesting. So if I've got the argument correctly, the thought is that it makes a big difference once we see the state relationship to refugees as one of harming rather than one as you put it, like a mere bystander. Is that the thought? So perhaps it might be justified. Were the relationship to be one of a bystander, it's just like the person standing on the side of the pond who kind of or doesn't reach in to help the child. Maybe if it was in that situation, then certain justifications might work, but once we change it and think, no, this is actually a situation involving harm, some of the justifications no longer work. Is that kind of figuring?
Yeah, that's broadly right. So it's aimed to demonstrate. So suppose there's the child drowning and you could easily save them at little cost to himself. It might be very wrong to not do so. So very wrong to not perform one's positive duties. But I guess what I'm trying to suggest here is that it would be even worse to actively interfere and harm them further, say by blocking their escape from this pond. And so, yes, I think this has implications for the costs states may be obligated to bear in order to fulfill their respective duties. So it might be the case that if the cost to you for saving the child would be very substantial, then you might not necessarily be obligated to save the child. But things might be otherwise if there would be substantial costs to you if you avoided harming a child. You might be obligated to incur more substantial costs to avoid harming than you would be to perform a positive duty to aid. And so standard justifications for a right to control borders, which may, some philosophers argue, defeat the obligation to help refugees, for example, whether they be economic and cultural costs or a right to freedom of association or some such, are not going to be sufficient to pass the higher threshold to justify harming those refugees.
Okay, good. So, you've gone through various justifications in the philosophical literature. You particularly focus on this justification that makes this analogy between states and clubs. Talks about freedom of association and says, well, maybe a state is a bit like a club in that people have got these rights to associate with others and create a certain space where they get to live out their associational lives, and that can justify migration limits. Of course, that's not the kind of justification that's given in public discourse. I mean, the idea that a state is like a golf club is the kind of thing that philosophers, thought that philosophers like to play around with, but it's not one that people generally talk about. The justifications that, if you switch on the news that are out there, are more, for instance, that there's some kind of threat posed to the citizens of a country. The threat might be something like simply pushing up house prices and creating homelessness, or it could be worries about crime. You have lots of kind of populist politicians often talking about invasions. You were saying invasion of, this example with the invasion of Canada. Of course, for many politicians and their supporters, they see migration and large numbers of refugees as equivalent to an invading army. So somebody's given that kind of justification for pushing people back, just as a state would push back an invading army. What would you say in response?
Yes, that's a really important question. So you're right, there is this idea that refugees pose some sort of threat, either to security, political, economic, or cultural interests. So first of all, there's an empirical debate to be had about whether refugees do in fact pose such a threat. So taking the security interests first, I mean, there's no substantial evidence to support the idea that refugees represent a substantial security threat to citizens. I can't remember the statistics off the top of my head, but it's completely negligible. And so it's a myth that refugees pose a security threat. Instead, the reverse is true. Refugees are understandably averse to physical violence, and there's no correlation between the presence of refugees and outbreaks of civil violence whatsoever. So it's a myth, and it's an old myth as well. So even Jewish refugees fleeing the Nazi regime were viewed as a security threat, which was unsubstantiated. But in terms of political, economic, and cultural interests, again, there's empirical debates to be had about whether refugees will impose an economic cost on states. I think there's quite substantial evidence to suggest that an intake of refugees can in fact provide a substantial net economic benefit to states, particularly advanced capitalist economies with an aging population. And in terms of cultural impact, it's not at all clear to me that the presence of refugees will set back certain cultural interests. In fact, refugees can contribute to a nation's culture in a variety of different ways. But let's suppose that refugees would pose some sort of economic threat or a cultural threat in some sense. As you say, they might undermine wages of certain citizens or contribute to homelessness and something. I think that some of these interests are of insufficient moral significance to override refugees' urgent interests in entrance to a state. I draw on your own work here, where you suggest that we have these interests of citizens, but we have to balance them against the interest of a prospective migrant who wishes to enter. And so for notwithstanding refugees, but just any immigrant, they might have substantial interests in entrance. So they have the freedom to move across borders will be a valuable freedom, which will be instrumental to their life prospects and so forth. And so we need to balance these interests as which is morally important, which is more morally important. And then we can even grant that a state has agent relative permissions to give priority to its own citizens' interests over those of outsiders, right? So that might justify excluding immigrants. But even such priority-weighted interests are going to be insufficient to override refugees' most urgent interests in entrance, which is often necessary to protect their most basic human rights, lives, and basic needs. So it's not obvious to me that these economic and cultural interests of citizens are going to be sufficiently morally important to outweigh these urgent interests of refugees, and certainly not going to be sufficient to justify then harming those refugees in order to avoid those costs. Right? That would be an implausible distortion of agent relative permissions. We standardly accept, for example, that states are not permitted to aggress against other states and violate the rights of foreign populations, even if doing so would be greatly advantageous to the economic and cultural interests of those citizens. We recognize that that would be impermissible precisely because that would be a gross distortion of agent relative permissions in suggesting that these interests are sufficiently more important than the interests of these persons in avoiding human rights violations such that it could justify violating their rights. So I think those kind of interests, the perception that refugees might impose a cost to economic or cultural interests, is going to be morally insufficient to justify these harmful practices against them.
Okay, so I can imagine someone listening to this and thinking, sure, the... sorry, I'm going to have another go. Somehow the drinking is...
Sorry.
No, it's okay. I can imagine someone listening to this and thinking, yeah, harming refugees, all the harms that you document in the book sound absolutely awful. Yes, it might be hard to justify that. At the same time, people are really worried about, you hear this phrase a lot in US politics, for instance, chaos at the border. So there's a feeling that the state needs to be in control. Now, maybe more people should be allowed in. I heard people say this as well. But it's got to be the states that are making decisions as to who comes in and who doesn't come in. And without this system of security, deterrence, all the difficult, problematic, controversial policies that you document, without those in place, you would have huge numbers of people migrating without any control being exercised by the receiving states. So what do you say about somebody who's worried about that in particular, this issue of control?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's like a very legitimate concern, obviously. So I think, well, I'd question whether the current status quo is giving that sense of control or alleviating any sense of chaos at the border. And so I would agree that things could be managed in a different way, and I think they ought to be. So I think one particular means of responding to refugees would be active resettlement. So taking refugees from regions close to their states of origin and resettling them in states. Now that can be carefully managed and like an efficient way, rather than the current status quo where we have a significant number of refugees trying to find safety in northern states. And the only means of claiming asylum in northern states is by physically setting foot on that territory. So this incentivizes migratory movements and so forth. And so I think if you had, for example, a coordinated system among states where they participated in resettlement schemes to a greater extent, you could, in a manageable way, resettle a large number of refugees in a way that would alleviate this sense of chaos. And I think these harmful border practices, I mean, this is open to debate, but not only they cause significant harms and injustices to innocent people, they're also very expensive for states. So some of the containment arrangements cost states billions of euros, for example. So it's not obvious to me that the costs of maintaining these practices would be much less than alternative practices of either resettlement or providing for refugees in regions close to their states of origin, for example, through loans or preferably grants to host states in states that border refugee states of origin, so that they have the funding to provide the infrastructure to protect refugees, provide education, employment, and so forth. So it's not obvious to me that those alternative practices would be more expensive. And the current practices also are somewhat ineffective insofar as refugees, if they're sufficiently motivated from escaping certain severe harms, will try to find ways of seeking safety. And so there's a concern whether these current practices are, in fact, going to be effective. So I think I agree with this concern about a sense of chaos, but I don't think these current practices are an answer to that. And I would prefer more managed responses through resettlement or providing sustained investment in regional development as a better way and more ethical way of responding to refugees.
Great. So we've talked a little bit about the first part of the book about this issue of the idea that states could be harming refugees. Mm-hmm. In the later part of the book, you talk about positive duties, so duties to help refugees, and you make an interesting distinction there between helping people who haven't been harmed and helping people who have been harmed, or as you say, had their rights violated. Could you tell me a bit about that distinction and why that you think that's so important?
Yeah, so the thought is, so I think it's more significant that refugees have been subjected to human rights violations, both in the causes of their displacement and whilst they're displaced. So, for example, in the causes of displacement, if you look at the causes of displacement in the refugee-producing countries, it's extensive human rights violations resulting from conflict and war, but also persecution, cruel and degrading treatment, torture, rape and sexual violence, ethnic cleansing, and so forth. And then once refugees have fled these states, they've by no means found adequate safety. Instead, they face either a life in squalid refugee camps, where they face further extensive human rights violations, or they face destitution in urban areas, where again they're not usually granted equal protection under the law and are subject to exploitation, trafficking, kidnapping, and violence. So again, further human rights violations. Or they can risk their lives on journeys to reach safety in the global north, but again, they'll face human rights violations on these journeys. So they're suffering as a result of human rights violations, both in the cause of displacement and whilst they're displaced. And I think this is significant because, well, one, it means, so in order to test whether the human rights violation is significant or not, we need to compare duties to aid someone who's suffering as a result of a human rights violation and someone who's equally physically suffering, but as a result of some natural cause, for example. Then we can assess whether the human rights violation in particular is morally significant. And I think it is, and is relevant for duties towards refugees, because I think this human rights violation involves significant and distinctive harms to the victim of the violations. It involves a severe violation of their autonomy as they're dominated by others. It involves a severe violation of their dignity as they're subjected to degrading or humiliating or subordinating treatment. And I think it involves a violation of their moral worth. They're treated as morally inferior by others. And so I think these are additional harms that refugees as victims of human rights violations have endured, and that's relevant for duties towards them. So these harms are not sufficiently acknowledged. So I think refugees are in fact worse off and suffering to a greater extent than is commonly acknowledged in virtue of these additional harms. And that's relevant for duties towards them to protect them. So that yields what I call a strong humanitarian duty to alleviate not only physical harms, but those additional harms to autonomy, dignity, and moral worth. And the second reason I think the human rights violation is really significant is because, well, refugees seem to lack the capabilities to be able to enjoy their human rights. That is, they have human rights, for example, against torture, cruel and degrading treatment, but they're subjected to these abuses regardless, as if they did not have these rights at all. And so I invoke Hannah Arendt's analysis of refugees as rightless here, and I understand that to mean that, well, refugees lack the capabilities to enjoy the content of their rights. So they have the right against torture, but they're unable to enjoy that right because they're subjected to the abuses regardless. And so I think that this reveals that human rights themselves entail positive duties to protect and aid persons to secure their human rights.
Okay, so just to get the distinction more concrete, so there might be a group of people who, I don't know, to go back to the pond analogy, let's imagine there's people in the pond who have fallen accidentally, and then there's other people that have been pushed in. Would that be the kind of distinction that you're imagining here?
Yes, that's right, yes.
And then the thought is, that if you're pushed in, you're suffering something which the people who've accidentally fallen in are not.
Yes.
What exactly are you suffering from? Because both, of course, are in the water. Both are at risk of drowning.
Yes.
So you're not denying that. You're not saying
No, of course.
No.
Okay, so they're both like equally physically suffering. But I do think that the person who's been pushed in has suffered additional harms and injustices. So, first thing is that, in order to deny that it makes any moral difference, right, you'd have to deny that a human rights violation is a harm to a person. And I think that's implausible, because I think a human rights violation is a harm to a person insofar as it involves the domination and invasion of an external will into oneself, so that your body movements are no longer governed by your own will, but they're governed by someone else, right? So I think that's a significant harm. I think it involves a violation of one's dignity, as one is being made subordinate to the will of another person, which is quite humiliating. It expresses that in powerlessness against one's fellow human being. And it involves one being treated as morally inferior, as disposable, worthy of death. And I think these are plausibly harms to people. And so I think that second person has endured these harms, even if they're unaware that they had been thrown in by another agent. They have endured these objective harms. And it's also true that they've suffered an injustice. And so it's been the case that they've been treated in a way that they fundamentally ought not to have been treated in, and deprived of a fundamental interest they fundamentally ought not to be deprived of. And so for these reasons, I think we do have additional reasons to save that the person who's been subjected to the rights violation, yeah.
Okay, so that's super interesting, because as you said in the book, lots of philosophers have thought that the two are just morally equivalent. So you might think, for instance, that whoever, whoever's like nearest at hand that you can pull from the pond in, you should grab them, or perhaps whoever's more likely to suffer from the cold or is worse at swimming themselves. You should do it. Use some criteria like that to decide which of the people to save first. But you're saying no? You're saying that it matters that someone was pushed as opposed to just fell in?
Yes, I do think it matters. And that is, like, all else being equal, you could either save either. I think you do have stronger duties to save the victim.
So we should grab the people who've been pushed in first before we grab the people who've fallen in?
I think so. I mean, up to a limit, right? It's not absolute. But yes, I think we do have stronger duties to...
What's the limit?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, in my view, the additional harms of a human rights violation are not so substantial that we ought to always save victims of human rights violations over those who are suffering as a result of natural causes. So if it were the case that we could either save one person drowning as a result of the human rights violation, or 5 people drowning as a result of natural causes, I think we should probably save the 5 from the natural causes, because that additional harm is not going to be sufficient to outweigh the additional harm to the 4 additional people there. So I don't have a precise limit. All I'm saying is that it is morally relevant. There are harms that obtain when people are subjected to human rights violations, and there is an injustice involved, and we have duties to prevent and counteract injustices against our fellow human beings. And so these factors are morally relevant, but the weighting of them is obviously a very difficult question. Yeah.
So going back to refugees, you're saying, well, look, refugees are a group of people who are like the people who've been pushed into the pond. They're not like people who've just fallen in. And so that makes a moral difference when we think about our duties to refugees. And perhaps will make a difference. For instance, there's been lots of discussion around effective altruism. It's something that you briefly mentioned in the book. And effective altruists, a movement that's become important, popular in Silicon Valley, etc. Those people are, as I understand it, just looking to kind of minimize harm or maximize welfare. And so they will just be looking around for, say, to use the analogy, the person in the pond who's the coldest or the weakest swimmer, and trying to get them out first. But you're critical of that kind of approach.
Yes, I think so. So I think we ought to be sensitive to these additional harms that result from human rights violations, and we ought to be sensitive to considerations of justice. So I think it's not the case that there are merely duties to alleviate harm and suffering. We also have duties to prevent and counteract injustices against persons, right? And I think this is something that we ought to take into account, and effective altruists ought to take into account. So this might have certain implications for cause prioritization within global ethics of aid, for example. But again, it's a difficult question of weighting. But what I suggest is that obviously I don't deny duties to alleviate harm and suffering that result from natural causes. We may have very strong duties indeed. But if we're faced with a choice about whether to aid a group of people who are suffering as a result of natural causes or aid a group of people who are suffering as a result of human rights violations, we can weigh the duties in the following way. If the difference in level of absolute physical well-being between the groups is greater than the harm of the human rights violations, and the duty we have to prevent and counteract those violations as injustices, so if the difference in level of well-being is greater than that, then we ought to aid those who are worst off as a result of natural causes. So for example, faced with the choice between either improving the economic rights of a group of women in a country, or saving an equally sized group of women from suffering severely from malaria, we ought to save that group suffering from malaria precisely because their level of well-being is substantially lower than the first, suppose for the example. And the economic rights deprivation is an injustice and is a harm to them, but not sufficient to outweigh that difference in level of physical well-being. But by contrast, if the difference in level of absolute well-being is not sufficient to outweigh both the harm of the rights violation and duties we have to prevent and counteract it as an injustice, then we ought to save the victims of the human rights violation. So, for example, faced with a choice between whether we ought to aid this group of women from suffering from malaria or save a separate but equally sized group of women who are slightly better off physically but are suffering as a result of their being subjected to sexual slavery, then I think we would have stronger reason to save this second group because the additional harms of that human rights violation to autonomy, dignity, and so forth, and the reasons to prevent and counteract it as an egregious injustice against persons outweigh the difference in levels of absolute physical well-being. So yes, it would require saving that group, despite the fact that in terms of physical well-being, this group is somewhat worse off. But I personally think that's the right result owing to how harmful and severe that injustice is.
Okay, good. So putting this whole discussion together, if I've got the book right, it's kind of like, could be seen as an argument for why, for perhaps surprising reasons, we should take the rights of refugees especially seriously. On the first hand, because they're being harmed, in your view, it's not just a failure to assist. And also because they suffer injustices. So it's not like they're just the victims of natural misfortune. So we've got these two additional reasons, and we're just not taking the rights of refugees seriously enough in the present world. Would that be a good summary of
yeah, I think that's a good summary, right?
Okay.
So yeah, we need this, first of all, an understanding of this negative duty not to harm and violate the rights of innocent refugees. And also we have this positive duty, which is again sensitive to the rights of refugees insofar as it needs to, first of all, respond not only to the physical harms that refugees endure, but also these additional harms of the human rights violation, so the violation of their autonomy, their dignity, and their moral worth, and also provide human rights protection so they have the capabilities to enjoy their human rights. So yeah.
Okay, good. So it's kind of like a plea for us to take the rights of refugees more seriously. Of course, we're in a world where, as you document in the book, the rights of refugees often aren't taken sufficiently seriously, and lots of injustices are inflicted upon them. And that's not because there's not people like you making arguments on behalf of refugees out there. There's many. But nevertheless, the kind of pro-refugee message just doesn't seem to be getting through. You've got kind of authoritarian leaders being voted into power across the world. Often, the support for these authoritarian leaders is precisely motivated by hostility towards migrants and refugees. And so I was wondering, what hope you've got for anything to change. You've written this wonderful, interesting book, but what can we really do to change anything in the current political environment?
Yeah, no, it is obviously very concerning. So what I try to demonstrate in the conclusion of the book is that this ethical response to refugees, which is characterized by those duties that I outlined, is not only urgently required, but it's within our reach. We can do it, and it's not an insurmountable task. And I worry that sometimes the issue of refugee displacement is framed, even by well-meaning people, as like a crisis, and the numbers are unprecedented, and this is supposed to kind of inspire people to respond. But I think sometimes it invites like alarmism, this assumption that there's far too many of them, we couldn't possibly accommodate them all, and then it invites these kind of short-term knee-jerk responses. And I think it's worth taking a breath and thinking, well, this isn't actually an unprecedented number of refugees. So there's around 43 million refugees worldwide, and that's about 0.5% of the world population. At the end of World War II, there were 200 million refugees, which represented 10% of the world's population, and they were able to be supported, okay, with some difficulty, but we've responded to far worse displacement crises in the past, and we have a vast array of policies that are able to alleviate human misery. And so, for example, with the positive duties that I outlined, so this might require nothing more than an expansion of resettlement. And so of the approximately 2 million refugees identified by the UNHCR as in most need of resettlement, if split between the 29 resettlement states, which are states that typically participate in these resettlement schemes, then they would each take about 50,000 each, and that would provide safety to 2 million of the most vulnerable refugees. So that's certainly possible. And the provision of like humanitarian visas to enable refugees so these would provide documentation that refugees could then use on commercial airlines to travel safely, as opposed to risking their lives on a dangerous journey. This is a policy available to us that we could use. And now it might sound like pie in the sky kind of stuff. And, a skeptic might say, well, there's no way that we could do this. And it's like, well, as I suggest in the postscript, we have already done this, at least with respect to Ukrainian refugees, right? So, for example, consider that there are no Ukrainian refugees currently being beaten up at the borders, forced into detention centres, forced into camps against their will, or contained in regions where they face human rights violations. Instead, European states in particular responded with a variety of measures that provided adequate safety and human rights protection to Ukrainian refugees. So the EU Council activated this Temporary Protection Directive, I believe it's called, which granted automatic rights for Ukrainian refugees to access work, employment, education, social security, and so forth. And the UK has this sponsorship scheme where Ukrainian refugees can online apply for a visa and then get it and then go on commercial travel. I think the Eurostar was even providing free travel to Ukrainian refugees to arrive to the UK. And of course, this is wonderful. But what I think it demonstrates is that this ethical response is possible, because it's already a reality for at least many refugees, and it can and therefore ought to be expanded to all. So I would say to those people who are skeptical about this that we can do this. It's possible to do it. But I acknowledge that there are going to be some public concerns. I mean, in my experience, and I think some of the empirical data bears this out, is that people can be kind of split on this issue. So there'll be approximately 10% of the population who are very much pro-refugee, advocating for refugee rights, and there'll be 10% of the population that's very much anti-refugees, and there's no hope with them. You're not going to persuade them. But the majority of the people, maybe it's not 80%, maybe it's slightly less, form what we might call an anxious middle. Now, these are people that might think, who are moved by the plight of refugees, but nonetheless have concerns about the economy and maybe, we can't probably take them all in and all the rest of it. So, like, understandable concerns. So I think the appropriate response is to try and address this group of people and try and have meaningful dialogue with people to present this moral case for refugees, to demonstrate that our responses is possible, and therefore to bring people on board. So I think activists have a role to play in that. Politicians definitely have a role to play in that because they are immensely influential on shaping public opinion on certain issues, and of course the media has a role to play in that. But I think, yes, it can be possible.
Okay, good. So to bring us back to the beginning, and you were talking about your personal experiences of being involved in fights for refugee protection. It's interesting how you document some of that in the book, and I was really struck by that because philosophers generally don't talk about their life experiences, but you do. I was wondering, first of all, what you thought is gained by that, whether you think that that's something philosophers should do more of, both, engaging with the real world in terms of engaging with the issues directly that they're writing about, and then finding a way to include those reflections in their work. Is that something that you want to promote more widely in the discipline?
Well, obviously it depends on the area the philosopher's working on, but I think when you're working on certain particular applied issues like obligations towards refugees, then I think it is very important to pay close attention to the situation of those refugees, have conversations with those affected, those with lived experience, because that will provide insights that you could not otherwise have received. And I think there are examples of normative analysis kind of going awry because it fails to sufficiently engage with these the features of the situation of refugees. So I do think it's very important to have that engagement. And so what I try to do in the book is have a refugee-centered focus, so as opposed to a state-centered focus. So standardly, the starting point for an analysis of obligations to refugees is to start with the state as the first point of analysis. So we start with the state and we theorize from there about, right, what would this state have to do, or what would this state be obligated to do faced with the presence of refugees? And then we get into debates about, well, how many would be too many to take in, and what would be the appropriate burden sharing responsibilities between these groups of states. If you start with a refugee-centered focus, you focus on the situation of refugees, and the thought is you need to understand this situation in order to understand what the moral obligations would be towards them, and then from that starting point you arrive at a different perspective, a different understanding of the issue. So I do think it's very important to engage with those affected by the issues we're theorizing about.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.